Hey there, this is Ari. Welcome back to the show. Before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know about one of the biggest hidden causes of fatigue that most people never really consider, and that is nutrient deficiencies. First of all, did you know that your body requires over 30 different vitamins and minerals in adequate or optimal amounts in order to facilitate energy production? Okay, that's a simple fact. Now, consider this pretty shocking fact. Over 9 out of 10 people have at least one deficiency in those different nutrients. Okay, now, to break it down even further, over 50% of people don't meet the recommended daily allowances for things like vitamin A, calcium, and magnesium. And if you look at data on the percentage of the population in the US that are not meeting the recommended daily allowance for many of these different vitamins and minerals, here's what we find. And this is the actual data. So you see things like deficiencies in B vitamins like riboflavin and niacin and thiamine and B12 and B6 are extremely common. Over 1 in 3 people, or around 1 in 3 people, are deficient in at least one of those things. Then you have folate, which is another B vitamin. Over 75% of the population is not getting adequate levels of folate. These are critical cofactors involved in energy production at the cellular level. And deficiencies are shockingly common. Then you have other, minerals. You have things like zinc deficiency, magnesium deficiency, calcium deficiency, vitamin E deficiency, vitamin C deficiency. And we can see on and on and on that, 50% or more of the population is deficient in at least one of those things. So putting this all together, the vast majority of the population have a deficiency in at least one of these things, and more than likely 3 to 5 or even upwards of 8 to 10 deficiencies in these various nutrients that are needed for optimal health and energy production. And this is the reason that we formulated our new supplement, Energy Essentials and Superfoods. It is absolutely packed with a bunch of incredible superfoods, things like spirulina, chlorella, moringa, pomegranate, blueberry extract, bilberry, all kinds of really incredible superfoods with proven health benefits from dozens and dozens of studies. But more to the point of this, it is a comprehensive, ultra premium vitamin and mineral formula with all of the absolute best, most optimal, most bioavailable forms of all of these different vitamins and minerals to make sure that every day when you take this cocktail, you are flooding your body with adequate amounts of all of these different nutrients that are needed for your cells to express optimal health and optimal energy levels. So go check it out. It's an amazing formula. I think you're going to be blown away by the results. And I think you're going to be blown away by the research behind a lot of these compounds that are in this formula. So you can find that at store.theenergyblueprint.com. And again, it's called the Energy Essentials and Superfoods. And they are, as the name implies, the essentials for optimal energy levels and health. Because if you don't have adequate amounts of these foundational nutrients that are needed for your cells to produce energy, of course, this is going to be a major hidden cause of fatigue. So go check it out, Energy Essentials and Superfoods. You can get it at store.theenergyblueprint.com. Hey there, this is Ari. Welcome back to the show. In this episode, I am talking with my good friend, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, on why optimizing your body composition is one of the big keys to superhuman energy levels. Enjoy the episode. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm here with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who is a Washington University fellowship-trained physician in nutritional science and geriatrics and is board certified in family medicine and osteopathic manipulation. She completed her undergraduate degree in human nutrition, vitamin and mineral metabolism at the University of Illinois, and she works closely with the Special Operations Military as part of the Task Force Dagger Foundation and has a private practice in New York City.
In addition, her practice services innovators, mavericks, executives, and anyone looking to upgrade and optimize their health. She brings unparalleled results to her patients with personalized advanced nutritional interventions, metabolic and genetic testing, and behavioral action focused implementation. She leverages evidence-based medicine with emerging cutting-edge science to restore metabolism, balance hormones, and optimize body composition with the goal of a lifetime of vitality. And in this presentation, in this interview, she's going to be talking all about optimizing body composition and leveraging your nutrition for the purposes of optimizing body composition and how that relates to your energy levels and optimizing your body for superhuman energy levels. This has also been an interview a long time in the making. We've literally been trying to connect for, I think, a year and a half now through dozens of texts and emails exchanged and babies being born and navigating all of that territory. So it's finally happening, which I'm really grateful for because I'm really a big fan of her work. So welcome, Dr. Lyon. Such a pleasure to have you.
I'm so grateful to be here. And I have to say my dad is a super fan of your work. So he is going to be particularly pumped today.
Awesome. Stoked to hear that. So let's first talk about the big picture of this. How does, and I want to say there's some really cool stuff that we're going to get into that very few people are talking about body composition more broadly, but about protein in particular, and muscle mass, and how there's so many myths and misunderstandings around this that she's doing great work to debunk. And I'm really excited about that. But first, I would love to kind of get into the broad picture of body composition and how that relates to overall metabolic health and energy production by our cells.
And I'm so happy to do that. It's really interesting, the current climate of what we talk about as it relates to obesity, largely a BMI over 30. And we have this perspective that obesity is the problem, considering diabetes, Alzheimer's, which is type 3 diabetes of the brain, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, you name it, any cardiometabolic disease can be related to obesity. What's so fascinating, though, is this concept of focusing on the problem rather than the solution. So the issue isn't that we're over fat. That's a byproduct from a very broad way of speaking, because the issue is being under-muscled. Mm. So it's the fact that we don't have healthy muscle tissue, because muscle is your metabolic currency. And it's muscle as the underlying endocrine organ that is really at the root cause of these diseases of obesity, these diseases of chronic aging, like diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, hypertension. So the concept, and we've chatted about this before, is this concept of muscle-centric medicine. And it's the idea that muscle is the largest organ in the body. And it's the largest endocrine organ in the body. When you contract it, it secretes proteins called myokines, which then go through the body and are anti-inflammatory. They protect our bone, our brain, our heart, our liver. They are systemically anti-inflammatory. In addition to muscle as a metabolic organ, when it's almost like this suitcase. So have you ever tried to overstuff a suitcase? Mm-hmm. All of us have, right? Mm-hmm. That is really what happens when we're continuously overeating. So glycogen needs to be depleted. But if you are in a space where you are not training and you are not exercising and you're not going through muscle glycogen depletion, you then are overstuffing the tissue. And just,
there's going to be a segment of people who don't know what glycogen is or what it means to deplete glycogen. So just explain that a bit.
So that's the storage form of energy for muscle tissue. And the way to deplete it is you exercise the muscle. Mm-hmm. If you exercise the muscle, you deplete its energy stores, so then smartly you can refill them. If you are inactive, so inactivity is an inflammatory state, which is something that we can control, which blows my mind. Just the concept of being inactive is at baseline an inflammatory state. Mm-hmm. So when you have full muscle glycogen, how do you get muscle glycogen? You eat food. The food that you eat goes to different parts of the body. One of those main reservoirs for storing food is muscle, not adipose tissue, but glycogen, which is glucose. And then it, you utilize glucose to form glycogen. You have to deplete that. Otherwise, it just sits there. Mm-hmm. What happens is then you begin to, so then you're overeating. So you haven't moved, you haven't depleted this glycogen. You then continue to eat. When you then continue to eat, the muscle, which is your metabolic currency, can no longer utilize fuels. So the fuels like fatty acids and amino acids spill back into the bloodstream. This is the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, there was you just made me think of a video that I did several years ago where I was on a walk out in nature and I was pointing out all of these different animals to people. So, you know, ducks, all kinds of different birds and squirrels and rabbits and I forget what else. I maybe even saw some snakes on this walk. I used to live in a place called Winter Park. So I used to see all these animals pretty much every day on my walks. And I would say, look at their consumption of food relative to their movement. They spend all day moving their bodies and contracting their muscles, and then get little nibbles of food, contract, lots of muscle contractions, nibbles of food, lots of muscle contractions, nibbles of food. I mean, the whole pattern is like that. And then for modern humans, it's like almost no muscle contraction, but lots of food coming into the system.
Right. And so then the subsequent reality is people become obese. It's not because they're simply over consuming calories. Yes, that's an issue. But the adiposity comes when your muscle tissue can no longer dispose of glucose, right? So it's one of the largest sites for glucose disposal is the muscle tissue, which is getting the glucose out of the bloodstream and putting it somewhere, right? Because glucose at its baseline is toxic. Mm-hmm. So really this paradigm shift of being over fat to under muscled is really key, especially in your domain of energy, of having superhuman energy. If you can get your muscle and body composition right, and you get your nutrition right, if you do proper feeding at your first meal, by your second meal, you feel better. Mm-hmm. You don't have to wait a month. It's literally that quick of a turnaround time.
Yeah. So specifically, let's make the connection with you know, cellular energy production with the amount of energy that our cells are producing. So what's the connection, the physiological mechanisms that connect, you know, muscle mass, insulin resistance, excess adiposity, accumulation of body fat? What specifically is going on that would limit energy production?
Yes. So one of the things that happen is adipose tissue as it relates to mitochondrial function and energy production. Muscle is very good at utilizing and creating energy, right? I mean, it's the mitochondria of the skeletal muscle is the powerhouse of the cell. When muscle tissue is replaced with adiposity, you know, everyone's seen a marbled steak. You overall have less energy. You overall have less mitochondria in your skeletal muscle. It is replaced with fat tissue. And now it's interesting because there is fat droplets within muscle tissue that can be used for energy. This is not what I'm talking about. These are not the long marathon runners. I am talking about average people who are becoming overweight because they have unhealthy muscle and are becoming more fatigued because they have less mitochondria, less functioning mitochondria, which is the energy production site.
Yeah.
That is a real issue.
Yeah. And there's a whole bunch of studies on measuring mitochondria, the amount of mitochondria in cells and mitochondrial capacity and aging, showing about 8-10% decline each decade. But so this correlates to about 50 to 75% loss of mitochondrial capacity from the ages of 20 to 70 for most people. But specifically, there's studies where they've looked at lifelong exercisers and shown that massive decline in mitochondrial capacity does not happen in people who are lifelong exercisers.
And that's a great point. And especially what is important here is resistance training as well as cardiovascular. It's interesting. And when we think about cardiovascular training, I'm not just talking about slow, steady state cardio. You can cardiovascularly train with weights. Mm-hmm. It's about getting your heart rate up over a period of time, depending on how you program it out. And that is one way to maintain and keep mitochondria healthy. So there's the resistance aspect, which keeps muscle fiber types healthy there, right? And then there is the oxidative capacity and the aerobic capacity.
Man, my brain's just reeling with so many questions of so many specifics that I want to get into, but
and I might not be able to answer all of them, but
I know I have a feeling you will be. But the next layer that I want to get into is this idea of muscle as a metabolic organ. And you've mentioned this a bit before, but this is an unusual framing of this thing, because even in endocrinology courses, they're not going to teach you, hey, muscle is one of the endocrine organs, the hormone producing organs. You're talking muscle mass is an endocrine organ. So what exactly do you mean by that? And what kinds of hormones or substances is our muscle mass producing, and what is that doing in the body?
So first of all, when we think about muscle as an organ in particular, I think about it really in two capacities. One as an endocrine organ, which endocrine organs secrete compounds that they can go systemic or they can go locally. And then the other aspect is I think of it as a metabolic organ. So there's really two kind of domains that I think are really valuable there. And then thirdly, if you wanted to throw that in, you can think about it as an organ for locomotion, which is arguably the most common. So when you think about muscle as an endocrine organ, contractual, and then it secretes things, there are these compounds called myokines. And what's really fascinating, and there's many of them. So you contract your muscle, and typically resistance training is, I would say, the most robust response, although there's some data on more steady state as well, aerobic. For whatever reason, aerobic exercise is largely studied. And they secrete myokines. And those myokines, there's so many. There's BDNF, which is very common, goes to the brain. There's also interleukins, so interleukin 6. And I want to spend a moment on this because this one's very interesting. Interleukin 6 is also secreted by macrophages, which is part of the immune system, and in a response to an infection or an upregulation of an individual's immunity. In that domain, it is actually considered inflammatory. However, interleukin 6, secreted by the muscle tissue, is perhaps acutely inflammatory and then over the long haul anti-inflammatory. So this is one way in which muscle, as it is, healthy muscle, which secretes these things, largely anti-inflammatory. And again, there's so many of these. And, this is a very young science, which is why I think it's largely not talked about. I think that it's, we're talking about basic molecular science that is still emerging, really, and people are spending their life working in the lab, doing muscle biopsies, seeing what these things are. And so from an endocrine standpoint, that's part of it, and even as it relates to bone health, right? So you contract your muscle, it's not just the force. It's also the fact that these myokines are then there's an interplay, an intertalk between them. Which is so fascinating.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Now, so this is the anti-inflammatory component of muscle, right? And it's pretty simple in the context of you have to train it. It needs to be healthy. And then there is the metabolic component. And this is largely relates to body composition. Having healthy muscle is the site for 80% of glucose disposal, which is basically everything that you're eating. I mean, hopefully this crew isn't eating a whole bunch of carbohydrates, but if you were, muscle is really what you're looking at for the site of glucose disposal. In addition, there's a big push about cholesterol and statins, and we've all seen this, but muscle is actually a solution to that. It's a large site for fatty acid oxidation. Thirdly, just at baseline, it is responsible largely for your resting metabolic rate, which means all the energy, all the calories that you would be burning at baseline are largely determined by your muscle tissue. And right. So then thirdly, when we say muscle as an organ for locomotion, that's obvious, but it's, very pliable tissue that allows for activities of daily living and is largely related to our capacity to live well. The more muscle mass you have, the less morbidity and mortality you have. So that means the less you're actually going to suffer from chronic diseases. If you do, you're much less likely to die or be hospitalized from them.
I want to come back to that point because I think it's an important one. We should touch on this, the lifespan, health span aspect of and how it relates to muscle mass. I want to jump back to something you said earlier about being under muscled. So within sort of the obesity epidemic, there's lots of theories. You know, there was just the calories in, calories out theory for a long time, which has a large element of truth, but was also not very well built out as an explanatory model. And there's lots of nuances and layers to that story. There's the carbohydrate theory of insulin. There was the kind of fat makes you fat, low fat era. Like I said, the carbohydrate insulin era. And then there's the food reward theory of obesity, which focuses on hyperpalatability of the diet as a major factor driving up overall calorie consumption. And many of these have elements of truth and elements of falsehood. But this aspect of being under muscled. So what specifically causes being under muscled? What is the root cause of that?
I think that's a great question. I want to point something out to you and the listeners. When we started this discussion, we said, hey, I know what a BMI of over 30 means, or a percent body fat. Maybe you don't believe in BMI, but a percent body fat. I cannot tell you, Ari, what your percent muscle should be. And in fact, nobody can tell you what your optimal muscle should be. As a matter of fact, we don't know what mine should be either. Or my Navy SEAL husband. We have no concept. So when we think about this concept of under-muscled, we have not spent enough time looking at the solution overall. And we have focused incorrectly, right? Because we know the recidivism rate of obesity and gaining weight is outrageous, right? If 50% of us are overweight or close to that, the capacity to actually maintain metabolic health is sad. So, you know, when you think about being under muscled, you can look at someone and, you know, people might get upset at me for saying this, but you know if someone is well trained, period. Is that true? Would you?
Absolutely. I mean, you can look at somebody and see, does this person use their body to do intense physical activity or not?
What does their tissue look like? And this isn't a body judging conversation. This is, how are you utilizing your tissue? Are you training to a capacity that is actually going to move the needle for you? I love yoga. That is not considered moving your tissue, right? That is not enough resistance training. And again, I love Pilates. I love yoga. I think it's great. But when we are talking about under muscled and really developing that tissue, it's vital because it's an organ. And that means doing things perhaps, you know, and maybe this is a little more esoteric, that people don't want to do. And that means resistance training. That is absolutely essential. Body weight doesn't cut it. You have to lift load. So this is a long-winded way of saying under muscled, if we focused on purely addressing skeletal muscle and optimizing skeletal muscle through two factors, perhaps three. Number one, proper nutrition, which you cannot build in your 30s if you do not get enough protein, period. When you're 20, you could probably be on the Twinkie diet and do great. We've all done whatever we wanted to when we were in high school, and we've had some success. And that's true. However, as you age and your growth hormone and your testosterone, even your estrogen, and these things decrease, you have to be much more diligent with the changing hormonal milieu to then augment it in other ways, which would be through optimizing dietary protein. And that changes throughout the life cycle. There is a trajectory. There is this mechanism, a physiological change called anabolic resistance that does happen as we age, no matter how you want to argue it. And we can talk about that. The single worst piece of advice I could ever give anyone is, as you're aging, go plant-based. Truly. I'm a geriatrician by training, which means part of my work was in over the age of 65. And we'll talk about that. And then we talked about resistance training. So you have to stimulate the tissue. Then you have to have enough stimulus to be able to have enough substrate to repair it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is having a chronic inflammatory state like obesity or low-grade inflammation is very catabolic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important to understand, that you have to get inflammatory markers down.
Yeah.
And by any means necessary, which you talk a lot about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to get to some practical recommendations of resistance exercise, but before we get there, you mentioned protein. I want to segue into that because there's some important stuff we need to talk about that. And
very easy takeaways too for patients,
including what is some people will definitely perceive as a controversial statement around like going plant-based as you age. You know, we have people, obviously a lot of the vegan health gurus and Joel Fuhrman and Michael Greger and Dr.
all of which are sarcopenic, arguably.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. That's
yeah.
okay.
Neil Bernard and a lot, you know, T. Colin Campbell, a lot of those types of people, as well as even like a Walter Longo, you know, somebody who wrote the longevity diet, who's obviously much more in the direction of plant-based. So
I'd love to talk about all those.
Cool. So what do you think are the biggest misconceptions around protein and meat consumption in particular? And you can treat those as sort of one topic or piece them apart as you wish.
So there's a couple major misconceptions. And I just want to take a step back and do a quick history lesson about where we are now. So initially the powers that be released the food guide pyramid, and they said, eat low fat, eat lots of carbohydrates and grains and fruits and vegetables, right? So we did that and everybody got obese. 50% of the population got obese. Everybody got fat. So that was a mistake. I mean, that was a big mistake. Then we said, don't eat dietary cholesterol because that's what's going to change, affect your cholesterol. And we made all these fat recommendations, which they have also gotten wrong. So now we've gotten the carbohydrate story wrong, and we've gotten the cholesterol and fat story wrong. So it stands to reason that perhaps the anti-protein story is also wrong.
Mm.
I just want to point that out. So if history were the trajectory of history as we see it now has gotten every recommendation wrong, it would stand to reason this also would be wrong.
Yeah. Well, also there's the whole Gary Taubes carbohydrate insulin theory of obesity, and that's been put to the test in, metabolic ward studies, for example, by Kevin Hall in recent years. And they've shown at equal levels of calories, there aren't differences between the low carb ketogenic groups and the higher carb, lower fat groups. So we've gotten all kinds of things wrong over the years with nutrition.
Right.
Yeah.
So it would stand to reason that people like Joel Fuhrman and Walter Longo, who recommends 0.3 grams of protein per kilogram or something well below the RDA, which most of us don't agree with the RDA in the professional space, but we know that it's the bare minimum to prevent disease. And we can all agree on that. Mm-hmm. That's what it's in place for. So to then further recommend below that is devastating. It's devastating for an aging population.
Let's dig into that with a bit more nuance, because there's some diseases, I believe, that do show some benefit, for example, from more of a vegetarian, low protein intake, but there's also this potential for disease substitution. You may be lowering your risk for some diseases and increasing your risk for other diseases. Are there any specific diseases that are associated with low protein intake?
Sarcopenia, which directly relates to mortality and morbidity. Mm. I mean, you are sarcopenic, you fall and break a hip, you will not survive. You will never walk again.
And that is one of the leading causes of death in old age population, right?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I mean, cachexia, people that get cancer with no muscle mass, you will not survive. Mm. So, would you rather be small and frail? Osteoporosis. We know that if you're not getting enough protein, your bones will be brittle. Mm-hmm. Protein makes bone, period. And for me personally, I am not wedded to either side. I just have seen it in clinical practice at the end of life.
Mm-hmm.
I come from a very different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I've studied nutrition for over a decade professionally, and when you have studies that are like Walter Longo who is an editor of Cell, publishes a paper where the world leading protein experts all get together and write a petition to say, you have statistically made numbers that are incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't get published because he's an editor of the magazine or editor of the professional journal.
Mm-hmm.
This is a problem.
Yeah.
This is something other than science. This is propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this is.
Yeah.
Anyone who's had aging parents would say, oh, I'm going to have them eat less red meat. When calories are controlled, red meat has never been shown to cause heart disease, hypertension, anything that it's being said, cancer. None of this is real.
Mm-hmm. And to be clear, there is quite a bit of negative research around processed meats, like cold cuts, bacon, things of that nature, sausages. That's my understanding. But unprocessed red meat is what you're referring to, correct?
So unprocessed red meat, definitely. But I will tell you, the Annals of Internal Medicine published a group of papers that put processed and unprocessed meats through a gradation evaluation of data, which is the same data that we use to determine that trans fats were bad. Mm-hmm. And they found that there was no high quality evidence that we need to cut back on red meat or processed meat.
Wow.
And that's just the facts. And this was so emotional for people because they weren't talking about radishes or whatever, beets, that they tried to actually attack this researcher. Oh, he got industry funding, all of this stuff, which was nonsense. Mm-hmm. Because people are, at a very core against eating animals. Mm-hmm. And I can appreciate that opinion and I can appreciate that emotional response, but you cannot tell people that it is better for their health because it is not.
Yeah, and I mean, there's two overlapping things here. One is the ethical side of this,
right, and
the other one is the purely physiological and nutritional science.
Right, and I think that that's a vital differentiation to make. Mm-hmm. And you cannot, omit that discussion. Yeah. So the very fact of the matter is, animal protein and plant protein are different. We've been eating animal protein for 2.5 million years. It is arguably one of the things that allowed our brains to change because of its nutrient density. It's a high bioavailable source of iron, zinc, selenium. These are non-negotiables for us. Mm-hmm. And it is definitely part of a healthy diet, for sure. And they're not the same.
Now, let me ask you this. There's this other argument I know you're familiar with, the idea that animal food consumption, animal protein, high protein, all of those things are going to lead to increases in IGF-1 levels and mTOR, and that those things are going to decrease our lifespan, cause cancer, and things of that nature. What's the deal?
Glad you brought that up. So basically, the majority of our youth have great, robust IGF responses. So if elevated, and I'm not saying actually outside of range, but have a good IGF number, maybe in the 200s. If that was going to cause cancer, then our entire youth would have cancer. Mm-hmm. So this argument that and also eating protein and working out's not bad for you. Working out stimulates mTOR. mTOR is mechanistic target of rapamycin for the listeners. And it's actually a growth pathway that's been maintained in the body since the beginning of time. It's in essence, a nutrient sensor. And it's one of the things that senses protein. Once it senses enough protein based on a particular amount, which is called a leucine threshold, and we should talk about, before we end the interview, we should definitely talk about practical ways to reach a leucine threshold and stimulate mTOR, which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. mTOR is a complex that's in all cells. So it's in the brain, heart, the liver, pancreas, muscle. Mm-hmm. mTOR is exquisitely sensitive to amino acids in the muscle tissue. Mm. But it is not. But liver perhaps is sensitive to insulin or glucose. So the concept that mTOR causes cancer, it is not an initiator. mTOR is something that allows you to put on muscle. It allows for muscle protein synthesis, which is a good thing. No one would say that it's not. Also, exercise stimulates mTOR. Mm-hmm. So there are other things, but at the very core of saying that protein causes cancer is for people that have an agenda, that they just don't want to eat animals.
Yeah.
And it's a scare tactic. It's fear mongering for people.
Yeah. I think look, you can drink water. If you drink 3 or 4 gallons of water in the next 10 minutes, you'll cause yourself permanent brain damage, put yourself into a coma, maybe even die from it. Does that mean water is bad and you should avoid water and keep water consumption as low as possible? Right. Well, we also know that if you starve yourself of water and you don't drink very much water, there's a whole set of other consequences that emerge from that. And from what I've seen with IGF-1, and this very much relates to mTOR, there's a U-shaped curve of how IGF-1 relates to mortality. At extremely high levels, it increases risk of death, and very low levels, it increases risk of death to the same degree. And so, like most things, there's a middle ground of where you want to be, because it's neither a bad compound, or a good compound. It's something that is healthful in the proper doses, in the proper context.
Absolutely. And this concept of driving down IGF-1 by not eating protein is the wrong message. Mm-hmm. The largest stimulator of mTOR really throughout the body is excess calories and excess insulin. Mm-hmm. And we know that obesity is oncogenic, which means it's cancer. Do we know it's cancer causing? It's definitely cancer promoting.
Mm-hmm. So let's get super practical now. So we've talked about protein. We've talked about the importance of body composition, why we don't want to have lots of excess body fat, why we want to have more muscle mass. How do we the importance of resistance exercise also? How do we take this information and turn it into a set of daily or weekly, sort of a weekly regimen of practical strategies to optimize our body composition?
Fantastic question. So really, the first thing that you need to understand is how much protein you're going to need. So there's a couple things that we're going to chunk down. We're going to understand the total number of protein you need. You're going to understand the quality of the protein, and then the amount per meal, and then the distribution. So from a very practical aspect, something that is a great piece of advice is 1 gram per pound of body weight in protein. And if you're overweight, it's really ideal body weight. So for example, I'm 125 pounds. I eat 130 grams of protein a day.
Let me add to that, 125 pounds of rock solid muscle.
Exactly. Exactly. Listen, what I'm telling you is exactly what I do. And in the last 8 weeks, I've lost over 10 pounds of body fat and put on at least 5 pounds of muscle tissue. Wow. And I track it all. So I use an InBody, I track it, right? So if I'm just telling you one thing and doing something else, it doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. So 1 gram per pound body weight, or per pound ideal body weight. Now, so that's the one aspect of it, your total protein intake. You got to know your number. The second aspect to that is the quality. So plant protein is different than animal protein. From a very practical level, animal products have in it the correct amino acid profile. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins for humans. Skeletal muscle feeds skeletal muscle. Animal products feed other animals, right? Whereas plants, while you can do it if you're largely vegan or vegetarian, you're going to require 35 to 45% more. Mm-hmm. So from a practical standpoint, per meal distribution, you should have between 30 to 50 grams of protein per meal. And the reason you have this is because it triggers mTOR to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And this is based from a very practical level on that leucine threshold that is a little more nuanced and not necessarily something you have to memorize, but you just have to know 30 to 50 grams per meal spread throughout 4 to 5 hours if you want. Mm-hmm. Would be a great strategy if you are just starting out.
Yeah. And so you mentioned with the people who are plant-based or vegan that they would need 35 to 45% more protein than that. in order to equate to the same level of triggering muscle protein synthesis. But the difficulty then is also that people on vegan or plant-based diets are already struggling to even get up to the amounts that you're talking about. So,
Right.
I mean, at least sticking to a whole food-based diet. So I assume that go-to would be inclusion of plant-based protein powders.
Yes, or a branched chain amino acid. And for those individuals, I also recommend 5 grams of creatine a day.
Okay.
That's very beneficial. Listen, guys, you have got to protect your muscle tissue. It doesn't get easier in your 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to think, we're all in it for the long game. What does that look like? What is the next 5 years, 10 years? What is the long game? We're not getting younger, even if we wish that we were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? There is these things that happen, so you have to take care of it. So 30 to 50 grams, there's probably not, and that is, so for every 1 gram of protein, there's for every 1 ounce, there's 7 grams of protein. If it's gravity bearing. So what does that mean? So for a piece of chicken, if you're eating a 3-ounce piece of chicken, 3 times 7 is 21. That's a little too low. You don't actually stimulate that muscle protein synthesis.
Mm-hmm.
So you would want 4 to 5 ounces per meal.
Wow. 3 times a day.
Yeah. I mean, yes, if you are fasting, which I normally fast, I only eat 2 meals a day. So I will try to get anywhere, I will try to get 50 grams per meal, and then maybe I'll throw in some snacks to bump up my protein intake.
Mm-hmm.
But you can go through cycles of how you eat for sure.
Yeah. So I have very similar recommendations on protein within, for example, my Energy Blueprint program. I have 10,000 members who have gone through this program. And one of the things that I encounter over and over again is when people see these recommendations and then they start to implement them, they go, oh my God, I'm not even consuming half of this amount of protein.
Totally.
How
right.
it feels impossible to consume this much protein.
Right.
What do you suggest to those people who are realizing that they're not even close to your recommendations?
I think that you do, if you can begin to move the needle for them. So number one, they could always do protein shakes, but I really recommend, I love whole foods. I think that's incredible. For us, we eat a lot of ground beef, and that's very palatable and very easy. So you could do 2 bison burgers with 2 eggs and you've reached your protein, or 1 bison burger with an egg and you're done. You're good.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's really scaling back on some of the other things like carbohydrates and fats. So you have more room to really build that metabolic furnace and really build the foundation of your house, which is your muscle tissue.
Yeah. So let's address the resistance training aspect of this really quick. What would be your practical recommendations? What does the ideal exercise regimen actually look like?
One that is very specific for the individual, right? And one you're going to stick to. And that sounds super cliche, but whether you're trained or untrained, it's really important to get with a fitness professional that puts this together. We know that high intensity interval training is something exceptional to add into your program, whether it's 2 days a week. Again, it needs to be programmed out. And then big compound lifts like bench, deadlift, squat, functional type movements, kettlebells. The reality is if you are at home lifting 2-pound weights, it's not going to cut it.
Mm-hmm.
Any kind of challenge or resistance needs to have enough effort into it that it's going to change your tissue. It's going to move the needle.
Yeah.
If it's easy, you're not doing it right.
Got it. So putting this all together, if you could summarize, let's say your top 3, top 5 big takeaways from everything you've covered so far.
Yes. Number 1, know your total protein goal. Have a goal, have a body composition goal, track yourself. Do not leave things up to the nebulous of the universe. You need to have data. Data drives results. So if you want to change your body composition, get a baseline measurement of where you're at. Measure your body fat, measure your skeletal muscle. A lot of trainers can do it. They can do calipers. You can get a sense of that. Then after you've got that baseline information, know how much protein you're going to have per day. You're going to determine what that number is. You're going to pre-plan what you're going to be eating so you are not left to the whim of the oak trees or whatever they are. You're going to know exactly what you're going to be eating for the next week. So you're going to plan because planning allows for success. You're going to know exactly what your meals are going to be, how much protein. It's going to be second nature. You're not even going to think about it. You're
Beautiful.
going to have, yep, you're going to have a resistance exercise training in place. You're not going to make excuses as to why you can't do it. You're going to find reasons how to get it done.
Love it. Love it. This is so good. Dr. Lyon, thank you so much. This has been awesome. You rocked it. I love this conversation. I love this content. I think it's so important to get this message across because there's way too few people talking about the importance of body composition and muscle mass and how this ties into energy levels and quality of life, and also functionality, not losing your functionality later in life as a result of physical weakness, and also preventing disease and frailty and old age. And it's such an important topic. One more thing for everybody who's listening, who is interested in reaching out to you, at least following your work or working with you directly, how can they get in touch with you?
I am very active on Instagram, and that's Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. They can find me on my website, same name, usually, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and then Facebook, doctor is spelled out, Twitter, same name. I have a free protocol that you guys can download. I do send out a newsletter, although not weekly. With a new baby, I'm working on it. But I put studies in there. I put perspectives. I put opinion pieces, anything that, any upcoming talks and books and things I'm reading. So I put that in there. It's valuable. It won't waste your time. And I'm writing a book. So stand by.
Awesome. And if somebody wants to work with you personally, where's the best
so you
place
guys can email. So you can find that information on my website. You can email info@Dr. Gabrielle Lyon.
Love it. Love it. This is so good. Dr. Lyon, thank you so much. This has been awesome. You rocked it. I love this conversation. I love this content. I think it's so important to get this message across because there's way too few people talking about the importance of body composition and muscle mass and how this ties into energy levels and quality of life, and also functionality, not losing your functionality later in life as a result of physical weakness, and also preventing disease and frailty and old age. And it's such an important topic. And thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with my audience. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at The Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next one.